Hey everybody, welcome again to another Dorico tip video. My page formatting video has been amazingly popular and I think it's been really helpful. So I'm here to do a part 2 that has a little bit more of a deep dive into some of the special tools that you can use to really dial in your part formatting. I'm going to break this video up into little parts, so you should be able to jump around. So if you're having trouble making your score look great, or your parts, or you're having some trouble fitting it on the correct number of pages, this way you can go to that chapter and you can say, aha, and hopefully it'll help you get your parts looking amazing. So here we go. Now the score has a lot of different things that we think about than, say, parts. And so when we're looking at formatting a score, we want to make sure we're thinking about it as a score, as in multiple staves, as in possibly different systems. So you might have a line here and a line here on the bottom of the page. So these are all elements that are probably a little different than you're going to find in your parts. And so that's why we treat the score a little bit differently than we would treat the parts. So here we're going to dive into some ways of really helping with formatting the score. So I have loaded up a Christmas tune that I arranged recently of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen for my saxophone quartet, and we're going to look at how we can get this part formatted. Now, as it stands, there's a couple of problems that I see right away in the formatting. The first one is the fact that if you go from page to page, you're going to notice that the number of staves is the same, but the spacing is radically different. And so between this page and this page, it's really distracting to the eye, because you'll see this stave is way down here, but then it moves all the way up here on page 4, and it's consistent for a few pages, but then as we get toward the end of the chart, you'll notice that it happens again, and this time it's multiple tiers. The other problem with it is, if you'll notice, the average page has maybe 4 measures on it, but on this first page, it only has 3, which is a huge waste of pages, because for this arrangement, which really isn't very long, we have 27 pages of score, which is just not going to work. So we're going to take care of a few of these different elements to try and make it a little easier to read. So the first thing I like to do when I'm formatting a score is I'm going to decide, do I want to have multiple lines, meaning I have measure 1 through 5 on the top and then 6 through 10 under it on the same page, or do I want to fill the entire page with my number of staves, say like on an orchestral score? Now, because this is a small ensemble, I'm probably going to have multiple lines, because it's really going to cut down on the pages. If I did nothing but that in my page formatting, I would go from 27 to, say, 13 pages, which is a huge improvement. And so that's one big decision you always want to make. For me, anything that's, say, 10 staves and below, I probably can get away with formatting it in multiple lines. Anything bigger than that, I probably need to put it on one page. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take care of this first immediate problem, which is the fact that the spacing keeps changing on my score, where I go from, almost the entire page full to a far smaller number full. This really bothers my eye, especially in a larger score, say a concert band, where your eye gets used to tracking a line, and then you turn the page and all of a sudden that line has moved. It's really hard to read that way. So this is one of the first things that I'm going to change. So the first place we're going to go is to the layout setting. So that is your Command-Shift-L under the library menu. Now, there's a couple of places we're first going to look here. The first thing we're going to look at is our staff-to-staff spacing right here. Now, staff-to-staff spacing is how far apart each stave is in the score in one system. So what does that mean? So measure 1, as we know, is all aligned in all of our different parts. And so this is going to be the spacing between all of the different parts in measure 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on. Now, that's different than, say, inner system gap. Inner system gap is the distance between this group of measures and this group of measures. So again, if line 1 is part 1 through 5 and line 2 is 6 through 10, that would be that gap. Now, in the score, I typically use a relatively large number here, because especially if you have lots of dynamics, chord symbols, and things like that, we're really going to need to increase this number so that when the auto vertical spacing is applied, it doesn't accidentally do what it's doing now, which is when there's not much in place, it's going to squish everything down. So typically speaking, for me, on a score like this, I might use, say, 10. Now, already you can see that my whole score is spaced out pretty darn well. It's pretty darn consistent, and there's a little bit of alteration in there, but this is far easier to read than, say, if it keeps moving around. And I would much rather it use up much more vertical white space than have it keep changing on me. Now, this worked really well, and this was in conjunction with the auto vertical collision. If we go back into the layout and check out our minimum gaps, and there is our auto vertical collision, you can see if I turn this setting off, you'll notice that things got a little squeezed together, and look at that. I have a chord symbol running into a dynamic. So typically speaking, I'm actually going to use the vertical collision avoidance tool in Dorico. Now, especially in a score, we can actually turn this spacing down a fair amount to, say, like 3/4, because we really don't need a huge amount of space between these score items, but we just can't have them on top of each other. And this maintains a pretty stable distance. You can see there's a little bit of change from left to right, but probably not anything that's going to freak out your eyes as you're looking across the score. This vertical collision tool is really powerful in Dorico, and with few exceptions, it works really well. Now, it's really important always to look across your score every single page to make sure you don't have any orphan things or things that are running into your titles at the top and such like that. But for the most part, it's really good at formatting the page and getting everything to look just the way we want it. Now, we fixed the first problem in the score, which is getting the staves to be spaced well, but the second problem we're having is now it's taking up a huge number of pages, because although it looks great vertically, you can see I'm still on 27 pages. So to fix this, we have a couple of different options. The first one would be to try and put more than one system on a page, but maybe we want it to still be large. So this is where there's another great tool in Dorico, which is the default spacing for quarter notes, or crotchets is what they call it. Now, this seems a little odd, but what this is basically doing is, if you think of the measure as a grid of like beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4, if we condense that grid down and change the default spacing between notes, we can actually crush the music down a little bit. Now, this works really well in a piece that, say, has very few subdivisions like 8th notes or 16th notes, but as the music becomes more complex and more rhythmically complex, this becomes less effective. But let's check it out. Again, it's under the layout menu. So if we go here under note spacing, that's where you'll see the default spacing for crotchet or quarter note. Now, as this number gets smaller, you can see in the little display down there that it is crunching together the music. And the thing that you'll notice there is at 4, you'll see that it's probably not a big deal between the half note, the quarter note, maybe even the 8th note, but look what happens to these smaller divisions down here. They start to get really squished together, and it becomes fairly hard to read. So I would definitely caution you against trying to turn this way down. But let's see what happens when we take it down from 4 to, say, 3.5. Now, it didn't do anything to page 1 of my score, but you'll notice that page 2 now has 4 measures instead of 3. And if we go all the way to the end, we can see that that actually removed 3 pages of our score just by condensing the spacing a little bit. I find this to be really effective in music that has maybe nothing more than 8th notes and quarter notes, because it really allows you to squish it down. And from just a quick scan, I'm not sure I see any real hard collisions or anything that are really difficult to read, because that's always what we're looking at. And say maybe we want to turn it down a little bit farther, so maybe we want to move it down to, say, 3. Again, we removed 2 more pages. We're down to 22 pages. Our page 1, it didn't really change again, but look, we can see we are getting consistently 4 to 5 measures per system. And again, as we look across the page, it still looks pretty darn good. And so this might be a really effective way of reducing the number of pages, but keeping the systems nice and big. I know now that I'm getting a little older, it gets harder and harder to read really small systems, really small staves, so this might be a really effective way of crunching everything down so that you can really see a lot better on your music. But if you're like me and you're doing some publishing, one of the things we want to do is reduce the number of pages people have to print, because page printing costs money, it's resources. So this is where we're going to go ahead and look at moving from one system per page to, say, 2 systems per page. Now, there's no way of squishing the music without making the notes physically smaller. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the layout and we're going to adjust the note sizing and the system sizing. So again, layout menu. This time, we're going to go under page setup. And then we're going to look at this one where it says space size and the rasteral size. Now, this is basically just a bunch of fancy words for the percentage of how large the font is going to display. And when we turn this down, it basically turns everything associated with the music, makes it smaller. So it's going to make the staff sizes smaller. It's going to make the note heads smaller. It's going to make the chord symbols smaller. And it's also going to make the names of the systems smaller. But that's really what we're looking for if we're trying to crush the music down to have multiple systems. So right now I have it set it to size 3. If you're around size 3 is a great size for reading off a part. It's nice and big and bold. So you want to be a little careful about how far you're willing to go with this, because the music can get pretty darn small. The other thing I realized, because my monitor, as you can see from this photo, is gigantic. And so when I'm doing music work on this huge monitor, I really sometimes fool myself into thinking, well, how big is the music really? Because this is like double the size of a piece of paper. So I really have to kind of remember, even though I can read it really great on the screen, it might be too small when I print it. So here I'm going to start just experimenting. I'm going to go down to, say, size 5, which is a good readable size, but it's definitely a lot smaller than 3. Now you can see that it crushed our music down a lot, but one of the things you'll notice is because we have made everything smaller, now our default staff spacing is a little bit small. So here's where we want to go ahead and also reduce that spacing a little bit, because as the note heads get smaller, the chances of getting collision go down, so we can go ahead and crush that dimension as well. So I'm going to go back under vertical spacing, and now I'm going to turn this down to, say, 8. And so now each stave in the system is going to be closer together. And you can see now the music is a lot closer together, and it's really taking up a ton less white space. But we're still not quite small enough to get 2 systems per page, so we're going to have to go down a little farther. So I typically use the predefined sizes first, and then I can kind of tweak with them after I find a good one. So let's try 7. So now we're getting really close. You can see we're pretty darn small. We're almost there. I think our spacing is still pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead now and just kind of keep turning that rasteral size down until we finally can get a full 2 systems per stave. So now I'm at 0.047. So let's try 0.043. Not quite there. 4.2. Still no. 4.1, 4.0. Now you can see over here on page 2, I'm fitting 2 of them in there, but I'm not quite there on page 1. Now, some people are okay with page 1 looking different than page 2, but unless I had a giant header up here that was really taking up a lot of white space, I find it a little bit distracting. So I'll typically reduce until I can get 2 on page 1 as well. Again, we always want to check our vertical spacing to make sure we're not wasting space on the page, because that can really make it hard to get multiple systems. And voila, we did it. We got down to 0.034, which allowed us to get 2 systems on every single page. And again, we were down to, say, 22 pages before, but let's look. Now we're down to 5 pages. Because not only did Dorico make the 2 systems per page, but because the music kept getting smaller and smaller, you can see we're now down almost up to 10 measures per system, which means we took up a lot less space. Now, this is typically where I like to be for a score like this. I'm not reading it that carefully, and because it's more of a reference for this group, it's nice to have it be just a few pages so you can really flip through it quickly, and especially if you were going to conduct this piece with a student group, for example, then all of a sudden it's much easier to kind of keep your place because you're not constantly turning pages. Now we've come back to our same problem again that we had when we started, which is you can see that the staff lines no longer line up. See, the top line is far dramatically different on page 2 than it is on page 1. And look here, page 3 and page 4, again, are radically different. So this is where we might want to start messing around with our vertical spacing again to see what we can do about making it flow a little more evenly from page 1 to page 2 and so on. So this is where, again, we need to mess with our inner spacing, and we also want to mess with our spacing between systems. Because one of the things I find in Dorico is that we need to put a pretty big space between the systems themselves to enable us to be able to really get a nice spacing on the page. I'm not a huge fan of the auto justification where it pushes everything to the very top and the very bottom because I don't want a giant white space in the middle. However, I also don't want my lines to kind of move up and down like they are now. So there's kind of a trade-off here. So let's go back into our page layout. So the first thing I'm going to do is, because we have some extra white space on the page, I'm going to go ahead and turn the staff to staff spacing back up to, say, 9 to kind of space things out a little bit. Now you can see, unfortunately, it pushed us from having 2 on page 1 to having 1 on page 1, but look, it really did level out all of our other pages. So this looks really nice from page 1 all the way to page 5, but unfortunately page 6 has an orphaned single system, and page 1 only has 1. So there's a couple of things we can try to fix that. One, we can mess around with the gap between the systems. So if I go back in and I go down here, see I have this set to 15. Let's see what happens if I lower it to, say, 10. Now we've pushed system 2 back onto page 1, and you can see we still have our really nice consistent flow, but we're starting to crunch the 2 systems together, which is not a look I like. And so there's a couple of ways we can alter with this. First thing I'm going to try is I'm going to go back in and I'm going to look at inner system gap again, and maybe I can get it up to, say, 11 to push them apart a little bit. That pushed us on to the second page, so we're going to have to try another route. So this is where the auto justification can really come in handy. And so if you're having this problem where you just need them to push apart a little bit, but you can't seem to make the system work in the way you want it to, if we use the auto justification, what this will do is it'll push the top system all the way to the top, the bottom system all the way to the bottom. And if we have our notes big enough, this will allow us to fill the page nicely. So here's where you're going to start messing around with these numbers. Now, if you've never looked at this before, you'll see that it says justifies distance when we're at least 85%, and down here, the distance between the frames at 95%. What does this mean? Well, if we go to engrave, you'll see that you have a little readout here of how full each page is. And so this page is 87% full, and over here, on page 1, it says it's 98% full. And so you want to take a look and see, are we getting to those thresholds? And if we're not, then we may need to lower those numbers to push them apart a little bit. But as you can see, I think we're probably tripping both of those settings. But just in case, let's go ahead and lower those thresholds down to make sure that that setting is kicking in place. So I'm going to go ahead and lower them both down to 80 so that because we definitely want it to change. And look at that. You can see that that actually squished our systems together because it fully justified them now. Now, that was great for page 1 because it gave us a little extra space. However, on page 2 and page 3, now everything's a little bit crowded, and I'm not sure that I like that anymore. And this is why you have to be careful of that auto justification feature. There is a workaround here, though. Let's say this helped on some of the pages, but not all. This is where we could go back to our staff spacing and we could push them apart a little bit to see if that will help as it increases the size. So if we go back under layout and we go to the vertical spacing, and again, we're going to go staff to staff, and let's try, say, 9.5. Now, unfortunately, again, we pushed on to that second page because this first system is pretty crowded with vertical spacing avoidance, but you can see that it did lower the space here. Now there's kind of a trade-off. How do we want to fix this? How do we want to go back? So you're going to go back and forth on these kind of settings quite a bit when you're working on your score. Now, for me personally, I think this looked okay, but I think what I would rather do is I would rather go back to the justification, and I would like to either turn it off or raise the threshold up so that my systems will spread back out again. Because what happens in the auto justification is it's really going to force everything to be kind of at the smallest it possibly can be to see if it can't fill the page back up. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to go down under that justification, and I'm going to turn my thresholds back up to, say, 87 and 95, which is where I had it before. And see, I like this spacing a little bit better. I think it looks nicer, but you can see we have kind of this problem again. So I got to go back, and I'm going to change this one to 85. And you can see it spread that page back out for us again. So you got to work with these settings a little bit, and you have to be really fearless about keep going back in, keep changing them, see what it's going to take to kind of squish everything down. The other place that I sometimes find problems is under this one here with the resolution of vertical collisions, because sometimes if this number is too big, it can cause systems to really push together in kind of an uncomfortable way. Again, when I'm working on a score, the number one places that I'm going to look for problems are under the vertical spacing, so the system to system, the staff to staff. I'm going to look at the default crotchet / quarter note spacing to see how small I can do, which is my horizontal zoom, if you will. And then I'm going to look at that full justification, because again, I think this is now looking pretty darn good. All of the systems space out pretty well, and everything is looking pretty darn nice. Now, while we're in the engrave menu, this is where I might make some decisions about flow. For example, when I'm reading a score, one of the things I hate is when the beginning of a section starts like right at the end of a line, or you have a repeat sign where it has like one measure on page 1 and then the rest of it's on page 2. So this is where I might manually go in, click on a spot, and put in a system break, because I don't want that section G to start right there at the end of the line, because it's really hard to find visually. I'd like those to be much farther forward. The other thing that can look a little weird, you see how down here, my DS is kind of an orphaned single measure, and I can decide, but I have a feeling if I was to push that up a bar, it may overcrowd my music, and so I have to make these kind of calls. The other thing I might want to mess around with is this little marking here, which denotes the fact that we're spacing apart systems. Now, if you want to change that, that's actually under the engrave menu. So if we do the Shift Command E, we can go under engrave, and then we can go down here to, it's called a system divider. And this is where we can change the settings on the system divider in terms of indent, sizing, and all of these other things. However, if you want to change whether it's visible or not, that is under the page layout again. So under layout, we're going to click on staves and systems, and then we're going to go under system dividers. And this is where we can do extra long, long, or default. Now, I find the default one to be way too small. It's barely visible. Long looks pretty good. Sometimes I do extra long, but in this case, I think it's pretty darn nice. This is where we can also determine whether or not it's visible, because I can just uncheck this and magically they all go away. And maybe that looks fine for you. And maybe it helps with your page formatting as well, because sometimes those system dividers will actually bump into your music. Now, one last setting on the system dividers, back under the engrave, is do you want them only on the left side or do you want them on both? And so you have to go in here and choose this setting here, and now you're going to get a system divider on the left side and on the right. That one's really up to you. There is one last place I want to point you to if you're really having trouble fitting everything in, and that is just simply page margins. Again, if you go back under layout, under page setup, you'll see you can choose the size of your page, but down here under page margins, you can choose the actual margin. Now, I've went ahead and I've changed this from the default margins. Sometimes I find that Dorico pushes things a little too close to the edge, which sometimes allows the music to kind of get a little unruly, and it makes it so that everything is really high and really low, which causes a lot of white space in the middle. So sometimes I go ahead and I increase the top and bottom margin to kind of push everything toward the center a little bit. But if you were coming really, really close to making everything fit, but you just couldn't quite do it, you might think about lowering your margins, especially the top and the bottom. And typically what I find, if I lower these down to say 0.4, now all of a sudden, I might be able to turn the rasteral size back up to make the notes a little bit larger because I can fit more on the page. Although it doesn't seem like a big change, by reducing the margin, I was able to go from 0.034 to 0.036 on that rasteral size. And that really did make the notes physically larger, and it really didn't affect our pages. We went from 5 pages to 6 pages, but the benefit of this was we actually got the notes to be physically larger, which makes them a little bit easier to read. And so that might be a nice trade-off. So this is where I think the page margins sometimes are a great place to go looking for just a little bit extra room if you really are finding that your music is getting a little bit squished. Well, thanks for watching this video on formatting for a score. Check out my next video, which is going to be specifically on formatting for parts. Because again, we're going to use many of these same tools, but we're going to use them in slightly different ways. So it's going to be a really helpful video, especially for those of you who are putting out large ensemble pieces and you really need to get everything looking great so you don't have that uncomfortable thing in rehearsal where people are like, hey, I can't really read my part. The chord symbol's on top of the dynamic. I know we all hate that, so this is a great way to do it. If you don't mind, give a like to this video. I've had a lot of people really enjoying the page formatting one, so hopefully this little deeper dive will give you just a few more tools to help improve your Dorico skills and make everything that much better. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.